Hello everybody. So it's a lovely spring day out here in the woods, and as you can see right behind me, there's a nice assortment of some of our native spring ephemeral flowers. And today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about what exactly a spring ephemeral is and why they're so important. So as you might have guessed by the word ephemeral, these are plants that, much like the goldfish you brought home from the county fair as a kid and then left in a bowl of tap water on a windowsill, they aren't around for very long. They emerge early in the spring and taking advantage of the relatively open landscape, and they have to complete most of their growth cycle in a relatively short amount of time before things warm up and then all the trees and shrubs and other understory plants leaf out and take up most of the available sunlight that reaches the forest floor, at which point they usually die back to the ground and leave little to no trace that they were ever there. So some of these plants might look delicate, but you actually have to be pretty tough to grow and thrive in these cooler seasons. And there are several challenges that these species have had to adapt to. For starters, soil temperatures in the spring are much lower, which makes it harder for plants to uptake water and can also reduce the availability of nutrients because the chemical reactions that would unlock those nutrients are often not as efficient at lower temperatures. There's also the risk of a hard frost or a late season snowstorm. Although late season snows like this usually won't kill the plant, it can set back flower and seed production, which makes it harder for the plant to complete that important part of its life cycle within its short window of time. Another big drawback of starting your growing season earlier in the year when it's still cold outside is that the rate of photosynthesis, which of course plants use to produce carbohydrates and energy for growth, is dramatically decreased because the enzymes that are needed to carry out that process do not work as efficiently when it's cold outside. But again, these spring plants are tough and they've adapted ways to deal with these disadvantages. So spring ephemeral plants have two distinct growth phases. They have an above ground phase and a below ground phase. Now during the below ground phase, which takes place throughout the fall and winter, the plants use the energy stored from the previous spring to grow new roots and also form buds for the next growing season. Now when that next spring comes and things warm up, the plant pushes upward into its above ground growth phase where it produces new leaves and flowers for reproduction. And the proteins used for photosynthesis activate very early on in the growing season, so as soon as those new leaves appear, they can maximize their carbohydrate and energy production for their very short window of time that they have to grow. So here we are in the North Woods. This is part of the North Woods that was burned for the first time back in the fall. So we've been able to open it up a little bit and find some things that we haven't seen before. Like these little guys. These kind of mottled green and brown leaves here are the basal leaves of trout lilies. Genus Erythronium. This one specifically is the white trout lily, Erythronium albinum. There's a bunch of leaves scattered around here. So yeah, cool to see. We haven't seen these here before, but we do know they've been here a while because we did have a couple flowering plants in this population. Actually, here is a fruit, or a seed pod of one right there. So this was a flower, and it's already starting to go to seed. But trout lilies are interesting because they can take at least 7 to 8 years before an individual plant will produce its first flower. And it's kind of common among spring ephemeral plants. Unlike other perennials that can usually flower by their second or third year, a lot of spring ephemerals take more growing seasons before they build up enough energy to produce their first flower. So, something to consider before you pick one. And almost worse than people are deer, who really like to eat a lot of our flowers, especially the spring ephemerals, since they're the first plants to emerge after a long, cold winter, and they're pretty hungry. But it's really bad luck for the ephemeral flowers, since they only have a short window to reproduce before they go dormant again. So it's tough. It's a tough life. These tough spring ephemerals play a number of important roles in their ecosystem. They provide critical early season food sources for many pollinating insects and other wildlife. They also provide some eye candy and a rejuvenating sign of life for nature-deprived humans after a long, bleak winter. But one role they don't get as much credit for is functioning as important nutrient sinks within their environment. So there's an interesting idea called the Vernal Dam Hypothesis, which basically suggests that large amounts of soil nutrients can be lost in the spring as they're washed away from increased rainfall and seasonal snowmelt, and that early growing spring plants can help sequester those nutrients before they can be potentially lost. Now, it's not exactly a proven theory, but there is some good evidence to support it. For example, spring ephemerals like trout lilies have been shown to sequester large amounts of nitrogen and potassium in their tissues as they grow. Then, when it warms up and those leaves die back, they release some of those nutrients back into the soil, where they can be readily reabsorbed by the warm season plants that are really starting to take off at that point. One study suggested that spring flowering species like these could be responsible for sequestering at least 12% of the nitrogen released by the previous year's leaf drop, which is a pretty significant number. But these tough plants also face some challenges that they aren't adapted for, like habitat loss and encroachment by invasive species, such as winter creeper, our old nemesis, garlic mustard, and lesser celandine. These invasive weeds can grow and spread aggressively into our woodland areas, and can squeeze out almost all of our native flora if they're given the opportunity, including our spring ephemerals. And in this age of increasing biodiversity loss, it's becoming more important to restore and protect what areas we can before we lose these species and the important services they provide. Well, I hope I've helped to enlighten you guys a little bit on how important this group of plants really is. And make sure you take some time out for yourself soon to go appreciate them in person, because as you can see, there's more green on the ground and leaves on the trees, so it won't be long before these spring ephemerals retreat back underground and go dormant for the rest of the year. So go out and see them while you still can.